Hey, Nicole. Hello. Oh, good morning. Well, good afternoon. I'm sorry. Um, Welcome to our session on racism and journalism. I am Ron Nixon. I'm the global investigations editor for the Associated Press and a longtime attendee of this conference. Wish this was in person. I've been to every one of these except for the very first one, and very much miss actually being in person. Want to introduce our featured speaker this afternoon for most of you, my friend and colleague, Nicole Hannah-Jones. Excuse me. Nicole has won every award that's imaginable under in American journalism, and is one of the premier journalists, I would say, in the U.S. and I would argue globally for the work that she has done. I won't lay out all of her accolades here, but she's won the Pulitzer Prize, a MacArthur Genius Fellow. She was a genius before the MacArthur thing, but we codified it. And a Peabody National Magazine Award, and a number of other awards here too. And I think that most people now are familiar with the 1619 project that she spearheaded, which I'll let her talk about a little bit here. But welcome, Nicole. I know that you have long wanted to attend this conference, and unfortunately, it's not in person. But hopefully, we'll rectify that in the years to come. So, welcome to the conference. So let me just start out by asking you to just talk a little bit about, I know we're talking about race and journalism, but let's talk a little bit about the 1619 Project. And if you can just give people a little background on the 1619 Project, but also why you did the 1619 Project and the significance of it.
Sure. So glad to be here. You can hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Glad to be here with you. I am really sad because, as you said, I've been wanting to join this conference for quite some time, and didn't want to, my first time getting to do it from my living room. But I'm still honored and grateful to be here in conversation with you all, with my fellow journalists around the globe. So the 1619 Project, for those who are not familiar with it, is it was a project that we published in the New York Times in 2019 to commemorate the 400th anniversary of the first Africans being sold into slavery in the 13 colonies that would become the United States. So we kind of mark it as the beginning of American slavery. There were between 20 to 30 Angolans who were sold to the colonists right outside of Jamestown. And the project marked that 400-year anniversary with a series of essays that really argued that slavery is a foundational American institution, and that so much of modern American life, from things like traffic congestion in Atlanta to the American diet and why we consume so much sugar, to criminal justice, capitalism, and democracy itself, that so many of those things can actually be traced back to the legacy of slavery and the anti-Blackness that justified it. So that's what the project is. And now it's It's been turned into a series of books. The first two books come out next month. There's an adult book and then a children's picture book. And we're currently filming a documentary around the 1619 Project as well.
Okay. When does the documentary come out?
Who knows?
Okay.
I believe the documentary is supposed to come out sometime next fall, but having never done documentary before, I'm not sure how realistic that timeline is, but we are currently shooting.
Okay. Okay. So let's segue into the topic of this panel about race and journalism, which relates to what you just mentioned about the 1619 Project. But there's this enduring myth in media is that media is always kind of held power to account, right? And that, the media has been this bulwark against oppression and racism and gender issues. And that hasn't been the case, right? In some cases, in a lot of cases, the media has actually helped to reinforce those same things. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yes, of course. So as we know, the one, I guess it depends on what we mean by media. And this question, you mean mainstream media or white dominated media? And yes, in this country, as in many of the colonial the areas that Europeans colonized, the media has in many ways really just reified power. It reflects power and has been often a tool to propagate the policies and justify the policies of those who are in power. So we know that in the United States, there was a long history of newspapers that were, for instance, pro-slavery, that during the civil rights movement, many Southern newspapers were actually putting forth the messages of white supremacy. They were white supremacist newspapers. They took an explicitly white supremacist stance. They were opposed to civil rights legislation. American newspapers used to advertise the ads to find runaway enslaved people. Matter of fact, it was one of their main revenue sources, where these ads either buying and selling human beings or seeking to relocate enslaved people who left. And that is also true with lynchings. Newspapers, white newspapers advertised lynchings, promoted lynchings, told people where the lynchings were going to occur. So that has long been the history in the United States. And many would argue today we still see that type of reflection of power. I think the kind of glaring modern example is the way that newspapers covered or didn't cover police shootings. And it wasn't until citizen journalists started shooting video on their cell phones of police encounters to challenge the narrative of police departments that newspapers suddenly realized that there was a problem with police lying and with communities really being brutalized by police. But this wasn't their natural inclination to cover the police. So when you look at who shapes the news, the people shaping the news often are reflective of power. And so the news coverage itself is often reflective of power.
Well, let's stick with that. One of your big focuses on trying to rectify this problem, particularly in American media, is focused on investigative journalism. And so a couple of things. One, can you tell people a little bit about the Ida B. Wells Society and its mission, but also why focus on this particular area of investigative journalism in terms of making it more inclusive of journalism as a whole?
So, of course, Ron, you and I are co-founders of the Ida B. Wells Society for Investigative Reporting. And we founded this organization to try to help more Black American journalists and other journalists of color get into the field of investigative reporting. And that matters because, of course, we would argue that investigative reporting is the most critical reporting in a democracy. That's the reporting that exposes the way that power is wielded. It's the reporting that holds power accountable, that reveals the things that politicians or company or industry don't want known. I'm sorry, can I pause for 1 second?
Sure.
I apologize. So it's the thing that it's so critical, I think, in a free society, is to have journalists who are digging up and exposing corruption and abuses of power and really working to on behalf of the vulnerable in society, those who have less power. But it is also the whitest field in America when it comes to reporting, and I would imagine in many places. And that's because, as you know, investigative reporting is the most prominent reporting in a news organization. It's also expensive. It has high risk. You know, you could be working on an investigation for a year or 2 years, and they can cost a lot of money. And then everything has to be right, because when you spend a year investigating something, you better have credibility about the thing that it is you're investigating. So because of that, newsrooms reflect the racial hierarchy of society. And so the more prominent jobs, the jobs that are valued the most, the jobs that are considered the most important, don't tend to be filled by reporters of color or journalists of color. Why that matters then is there's just stories that don't get unearthed. Where journalists tend to focus is not necessarily in the area that racial minorities need the most attention to. But when you are a Black journalist, for instance, it's not that you don't cover everything. Of course, you yourself have covered, national security, every other type of investigation, but you're going to see stories in a different way. You're going to see stories that perhaps your colleagues don't cover, or you're going to see that those stories are important. So for instance, a lot of people know me for the 1619 Project, but of course I've been a journalist for 20 years. And my most prominent work prior to the 1619 Project was on school and housing segregation, and showing the way that today government officials are still acting in ways that are discriminatory and that ensure that Black people are living in segregated neighborhoods and attending segregated schools. This was not a news story, but it was a story that mainstream investigative reporters were largely ignoring, that wasn't that valuable to them. And that is why, to me, in a democracy, journalism must reflect the communities that it seeks to cover, both in terms of race, in terms of gender, and also in terms of socioeconomic status.
Okay, right. So what we hear a lot, particularly in this country, and I would say the UK, South Africa, and a number of other places where I've looked at this, is that, well, we can't find people. We can't find people from marginalized communities. Why is that?
Well, we know that's not true. They're not really looking. It's always amazing to me that people whose job is to find people, to find information. This is literally what we get paid to do. When it comes to finding qualified applicants for positions in their newsrooms, all of a sudden they lose all of their ability to locate, to dig, to source. This is why we founded the Ida B. Wells Society. It's because we had all heard these excuses from newsrooms that, they really want to be more diverse, but they just can't find talent. And yet all of us have had the experience of recommending people to these positions, right? Of saying, oh, you're hiring? I know someone who would be great. And those people not even getting an interview and not getting a chance to get those jobs. So I think that there's a lot of excuses that get made. I think that newsroom managers like to hire people from within their own networks, people they already know, people whom their friends or colleagues will vouch for, and their networks tend to be like they are. They tend to be white, they tend to be male, and we're not in those networks. And then I think that they're also always looking, not necessarily for what skills and experience do you have, but also, do they think you'll fit the culture of the newsroom? And when it comes to the idea of fit, that too often leaves out Black and Latino and Asian and Indigenous journalists, because they're more worried about how will we interact with them, or do we mesh with the existing culture, which is white dominated. So there's all of these excuses. And then of course, to a degree, there is a pipeline problem. But the pipeline problem is coming because we're not giving the opportunities. How does one become an investigative reporter if no one is mentoring you to gain the skills to become one, if no one's giving you a chance in your newsroom to actually use those skills. It's not that we have a lack of talent or ambition, but we do often have a lack of opportunity.
Okay. Well, I know that, and we've talked about this, when I was coming up as a young reporter, I didn't know of people like Ida B. Wells, for instance. I mean, I'd heard the name, but I didn't know exactly what she did. Or I didn't know people like, Dean Baquet, my former boss, your current boss, Les Payne, folks like that. How much does representation matter? Because the people that I saw as, investigative reporters, both in the US and abroad, were people like, let's say Bob Woodward or the folks at the Insight team in the UK. But I never saw people who look like me.
Yeah, it matters a lot. I mean, the reason we decided to name our organization after Ida B. Wells was to send the message that there's a long lineage of Black Americans doing investigative reporting, that it's not unusual. So when you grow up and you don't see anyone doing this thing that you think you might want to do, why would you think that you could do it? It is, to me, yes, there'll always be those exceptional people who think that they can be the barrier breaker. But for most of us, we tend to go in the direction where we've seen someone like us succeed in that area. I think that's one of the reasons why our field tends to have, I think the best representation in our field is in broadcast journalism, because you actually could turn on your TV in certain parts of the country and see a Black journalist on television. And so then you think, oh, that's maybe something I can do. It's not surprising when you see a bunch of white male investigative reporters. They could do that. That's all, the only thing you've ever seen. So representation matters because it demystifies. I think it opens a mental door for you to think that this is something that you can do. And one of the things that we've heard through the Ida B. Wells Society consistently, I know you've heard this, is you're the first time I've ever been trained by a Black journalist. This is the first time I've ever met Black investigative reporters. And if you've worked in newsrooms where the hierarchy, every person who's ever had an investigative job is a white person, and most likely a white male, why would you see a path for yourself to be able to have a position like that? But if you go in a newsroom and you see someone like me, or you see someone like you in there, then I think it opens a mental door for you. And of course, having us in those positions also means there's someone you can go to ask questions that you feel comfortable with. There's someone in the newsroom who will look out for you for the particular barriers that you're going to face. So that representation matters a lot.
Okay. Let's talk about unicorns along those same lines. Is that, there are white journalists who come out of like seemingly nowhere, right? They start out as a clerk or something, and then they morph into Pulitzer Prize winning journalists or something, right? But for journalists of color and journalists from marginalized communities, there's this tendency to look for a finished project, right? Or a unicorn, like this really amazing thing. Can you talk about that in terms of giving people opportunities that don't necessarily check all the boxes? Because honestly, nobody does initially, right?
This is where it goes back to, I think the thing that oftentimes Black journalists and other journalists from marginalized communities face is we don't get the benefit of the doubt. We don't get the person who sees kind of the raw talent or the potential and says, okay, they don't have it, but I can see they're like me when I was a kid, or they're like, my nephew. So I'm going to work on this person and help them get where they need to be. We are expected to come fully formed, perfect, already have all the experience and the track record. And that's impossible, because if people aren't giving you the chance, how do you then build up the resume to be fully formed? And I think that's one of the biggest obstacles that we face. We've all seen the young white journalist who's come in with a couple internships under his or her belt, maybe a fellowship, and the next thing you know, someone is grooming them for an investigative role. That almost never happens when it comes to Black journalists. And if that Black journalist somehow isn't perfect, then it also makes the hiring person think twice about hiring the next Black journalist, which is also not a burden that white journalists ever face. They don't have to represent everyone else like them. We have to understand, again, you can't acknowledge that we have a racially unequal society, that Black journalists don't get the same advantages or same opportunities, and then say, but when it comes to hiring, we just need everyone to be exactly the same. Part of what you and I and Topher have tried to do with the Ida B. Wells Society is, one, we haven't supported fellowships in newsrooms, because what we found, of course, white people with the same experience as a Black person get a job, and Black people get a limited fellowship where we're always having to prove our worthiness. So we haven't supported those things, but we have tried to create positions that say, okay, let's take someone who hasn't had that traditional investigative experience, but who has the ambition, who you could look at their work and see that they have the potential there and the drive, but all they need is a chance. And we tried to make those chances, but not enough newsrooms are willing to take that chance on us, even though they are taking those chances on other journalists with not as much experience all the time.
Okay. When you talk about the hiring managers or people in charge, that gets to the point then is that we're not just talking about making sure that people like us are reporters, right? But also in decision-making positions in terms of editors and producers and sub-editors and all of those roles as well, right? Because those are the people calling the shot.
Of
Can you
course.
talk a little?
Yeah, so I believe you're probably the highest ranking investigative editor in the country, right? Black investigative editor in the country. And that is extremely rare. Like you are literally a unicorn in that way. It matters because, one, we journalists, reporters who are not editors, don't have the ability to change the makeup of a newsroom. We have the ability to change coverage, but we can't hire people. We can't determine what are the areas that a news organization is going to focus on. We don't have the ability to do that. And if you don't have editors, you may not even have the ability to cover the types of things that you as a journalist of color might want to cover. You might have journalists who, like I face, like you probably face, who editors who didn't believe that writing about and investigating racial inequality was important, that these were areas that we should be spending our resources on. So diversity is too often resolved really at the lowest level of the newsroom, with fellowships, sometimes interns, traditional beat reporters. And then as you get higher, investigative reporters, it gets wider. And then if you get to editors, and particularly investigative editors, there's almost nothing there in terms of Black and other journalists of color, who are then means that you're not ever going to really transform a newsroom, because you're not going to have enough people being hired, and you're not going to have the people who are ultimately shaping the coverage being reflective of the country that we live in.
Now, you talk about this, the pipeline of the hiring, and so it's not just you have these structural issues, but sometimes people are actively discouraged from becoming investigative reporter. You relayed to me a few years ago about your experience, right, and wanting to be an investigative reporter, and you were actively discouraged from that. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yes, I mean, we face so many obstacles. First, you don't even know that you can become one, because you don't see anyone like you doing it. And then if you have the ambition, I think oftentimes we get pigeonholed very, very early on of what type of reporter we can be, whether we are the type of people that our newsroom should invest in, because becoming an investigative reporter does require investment. It requires editors who will let you take a long time on something, as opposed to just having to grind out articles, three articles a week. It requires some training. I knew that I always wanted to do accountability reporting. I didn't think about it as investigative reporting at the time, but when I wanted to go to trainings, for instance, at Investigative Reporter and Editors, I wanted to do their data boot camp. I wanted to get investigative training. I wanted to go to the investigative reporting conferences. I didn't get any support for that, even as my news organization was sending other people to those conferences. I had to find my own way. And then I had to beg to even get the time without having to take my vacation time just to go to the training. So what we know clearly from my track record as a journalist, that it wasn't that about my abilities, it wasn't about my ambition. It was about how newsrooms and newsroom managers saw someone like me, who they decided they were going to take their bets on, and who they decided they were going to invest in. And again, this is, the origin story for those who don't know, the Ida B. Wells Society is myself, Ron Nixon, another a journalist named Corey, as well as Topher Sanders, were at an investigative reporting conference and met in the lobby. Some of us didn't even know each other, and met because we were the only Black people there, basically. And we just, at that point, we're tired of having to fight so hard in the very particular obstacles to being a Black journalist who wants to do investigative reporting, that we decided to do something about it, because we understand every obstacle that is placed specifically. It's hard for anyone to become an investigative reporter, but then we have to face additional obstacles on top of that. Even though I would argue the work that we've done and the particular eye that Black investigative reporters have is some of the most critical reporting in our democracy, even if we don't realize it sometimes.
You were also actively discouraged from writing about race as well, right? So can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I have to say, some of the most, cosmic justice that I can imagine is the fact that everyone who knows who I am knows who I am because I write about race, and I won a Pulitzer Prize for writing about race. But I certainly, before the job I got before I came to New York, was penalized for wanting to write about racism, to want to write about communities of color, and not just Black communities, but communities of color in general. I was told first, as in a nice way, as someone who thought they were helping me, that I was going to pigeonhole myself as a Black journalist if I wanted to write about race, that it would be limiting for me, which I was like, I never understood that. What is more critical in the United States than understanding the dynamics of how race works? I mean, our democracy is at a crisis point right now because of race and our inability to deal with it. The insurrection on the Capitol, it's not incidental that the insurrectionists were flying Confederate flags, right? That they were trying to overturn a white nationalist president and arguing in Black cities that those votes were illegitimate. And yet I was being told this during the historic run of the first Black president, which tells you the kind of dissonance that journalists, many white journalists have, is thinking that even under the campaign of a man who was going to be the first Black man ever elected to the presidency in the United States, that my wanting to focus on race was going to pigeonhole me. So first it began as well-meaning advice, and then when I didn't take that advice, it became punitive. And I was really admonished. I would pitch stories and they would say, no, you're not going to keep writing about this. You need to write about other things, which I also was writing about other things. And it got so bad, I began, I'm a journalist, so I understand the concept of writing notes in real time. So I began to keep a written record of these conversations. I began to keep all the emails. And then I printed out, at one point when I got called into a meeting, I printed out every story I'd ever written since I'd been at that newspaper. And I put on one stack every story that even mentioned a Black person, even if it wasn't about race. And it was 10% of my stories. And I took that into the office and I said, I'm only writing about 10% of my stories about Black people, and you're telling me that that's too much. So tell me, when did you ever sit down one of your white journalists and tell them that they were writing about white people too much? That conversation has never happened. So this type of work, writing about racial inequality, reporting on racial inequality, has long not been something that's valued, and it's valued even less so if the reporters doing it are Black. So you could have a white journalist who would pitch the identical story as a Black journalist, and that would be considered a great story, an objective news story about racial inequality, as if white journalists don't have a race, as if they don't go through society having racialized experiences. But coming from a Black journalist, it was viewed as suspicious and not valuable. But I think I have proven that wrong, hopefully with my career.
The irony is that there are several white journalists who have made their careers writing about race, right? Like, cold case civil rights murders, or
Yep.
Redlining for bank loans and things like that. So you once said to me that I write about stuff that will change, but you write about stuff that may never change.
Yeah.
So why do it then? If race is this enduring sort of thing in society, and while there has been changes, globally, when you look at the disparities, they're still there after centuries. So why continue to write about something that will, in some ways never change?
Yeah. I mean, we've joked about this a lot, mostly when you talk about how long I take to do a piece. So yeah, most people, when you get into investigative reporting, you get into it because you think it's important to expose wrongdoings in our society, but also because you hope there's an inherent satisfaction that when that wrongdoing is exposed, something happens. If you write about Child Protective Services failing a child, you know that the possibility exists that when that is published, someone will be fired or a policy is going to change. And that is the satisfaction, I think, of doing this work. And I don't ever expect that with my work. So when I do an investigation on how the federal government has not enforced the Fair Housing Act for 60 years, I know that at the end of that investigation, the federal government's still not going to enforce it, and no one's going to really call for the federal government to enforce the Fair Housing Act. There's not going to be an outcome outside of, I think, more knowledge in the society. But I do it because I just feel it must be done, that we can't, as investigative journalists, we can't ignore the wrongs that are being done because we don't think that by exposing them that we're going to see immediate change. I think we have an obligation to report on those things because they're morally wrong, because people are being hurt, because our society should be doing better. And we just have to accept that we may not see a change, and are unlikely to see a change as a result, but we have an obligation. We have an obligation to tell the truth. We have an obligation to expose the way our society works to the benefit of the powerful, even if nothing will ultimately come from it. But what is important, I think, then is you do have to manage expectations with your editors, right? So you do have to say, okay, I'm going to spend a year on this, and probably nothing is going to happen as a result of it. That we're not going to, they're not going to get rid of the Department of Education. They're not going to fire all the school boards members, in wherever you report it. You have to manage those expectations. But I think a lot about, Ida B. Wells. Ida B. Wells spent her entire life trying to get an anti-lynching law passed. It never happened to this day. It's never happened. But should she have not written about lynchings because there was no hope that any of the white people who lynched were going to be prosecuted, which they weren't? Should she not have written about it because there was not ever going to be legislation against it? Of course, we wouldn't argue that. She had to write about it because these things were happening, and we deserve to know the truth about how our society was working. And ultimately, she was right, and we look at her now as a heroine because of the reporting that she did.
Just briefly, because I know, it's a global audience, not everybody's familiar with Ida B. Wells. If you could just give a little background on,
Yes.
on who she was and why we decided to name our organization after her.
Absolutely. If you have not heard of Ida B. Wells, I hope after this talk you will look her up. She's one of the greatest Americans that this country has ever produced. She was a woman who was born into slavery right around the time of the Emancipation Proclamation. She was orphaned as a child and raised her siblings, and ultimately became one of the most important investigative reporters in America, as well as a civil rights activist and a suffragist. She was born at a time when Black people were losing their rights that they had recently gained. Not born, she came of age in a time when Black people were losing the rights that they had recently gained after the end of slavery, where women didn't have the right to vote. And she began, she published her own newspaper, and then she began investigating lynchings of Black people in the country, and would travel to a place that had just lynched a Black man or woman and investigate. She also was one of the early data reporters. Before she did the Red Record, there was no cataloging of how many people were being lynched, what was the reasons, where were they occurring. And she would scour the reporting of white newspapers to get a lot of the details and the reasons that white society were saying that these people were being lynched. And then she would do her own investigations. She was a co-founder of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, the NAACP. And she also worked very hard to get women the right to vote in a segregated women's movement where white women were not so interested in Black women getting the right to vote, but only other white women. So we named the society after her because she is one of the originators of investigative reporting techniques, data techniques, but also is of the type of advocacy journalism I think that many Black Americans have had to do in the tradition of the Black press, that this kind of white norm of pretending to be objective is impossible when you are reporting in a country that is denying you your very rights of citizenship, when you are not even being treated as fully human in your society. Then you can't pretend to be neutral when you're writing about your government or you're writing about the rights that are being taken away. And so she just is my personal spiritual godmother. She's a template, I think, for the type of journalist that I wanted to become. And it was important, as I said earlier, that as we were saying, yes, Black people, you can be an investigative reporter, that we would show that you learn about these great investigative reportings in journalism school, and none of them are Black, but there were Black people doing this type of work really even during slavery and at the end of slavery. And that's really critical.
Okay. Well, thank you, Nicole. The conference is being, first for the conference is being held in several cities around the continent this year. So we have some questions from Johannesburg. So if you guys want to switch them over so they can ask the question.
My name is Gregor Gondwe. I'm from the Platform for Investigative Journalism, Malawi. My question directly goes to Nicole. I want to understand, looking at the struggles that you've mentioned, that the black journalists in the US, especially the investigative journalists in the US, seem to be facing a lot of struggles. And apparently, there seem to be two books of code of ethics, one for the journalists as it were when they are doing investigative journalism, and there seem to be a specific one for Black investigative journalists in the US. Now, I would love to hear from you how you strike this balance of not showing too much bias towards the position that you have taken, since before you even start working on something, you've already created this position that you are being sidelined as black investigative journalists. And on the same, I would also love to hear from you if that also compromises the quality of the work that you do as the black investigative journalists, considering that the others that you think are better off have enough resources at their disposal. So I really wanted to hear from you on those two areas.
I'm not sure that I'm entirely clear on the first question, but what I will say is I don't believe that any journalists are objective about anything that they cover. I think the only thing that a human being, and journalists are human beings, are objective about are things that they don't actually know that much about. And as soon as you have enough information on something, of course you form opinions and thoughts and feelings about it. What I argue for is objectivity of method. So it's acknowledging that, yes, I have thoughts about the politicians that are in DC. I have thoughts about what's happening in the public school that I'm writing about. Of course I do. But is my method objective? Am I being fair? Am I being accurate? Am I giving all parties a chance to say what it is that they need to be said? And am I then presenting their views in an accurate way? I think that is much more critical and much more honest and produces better journalism when we don't pretend that we don't have any thoughts or feelings about the things that we cover. Because by me acknowledging that, then I report into it. And then I have to be even more careful to make sure that my methods are as objective as possible. So I don't think that there's a conflict between being a Black journalist and being a journalist, any more so than there's a conflict between being a white journalist and being a journalist. We tend to, Black journalists are more open about talking about how our racial experience shapes our coverage and shapes what we do. But white journalists are also being similarly shaped. They just don't have to talk about it as much because they're in a white majority society in white dominated newsrooms. So I'm not sure if I'm answering your question, but I don't see that there is a conflict. I truly think that for the vast history of journalism in America, press did not pretend to be objective. Newspapers were founded with a point of view. The New York Times was a Republican newspaper. There were abolitionist newspapers. There were pro-slavery newspapers. In most towns, you could look at the newspapers that were covering, I don't want to get, I guess, too germane considering it's a global audience, but for instance, we're covering school desegregation battles. And there was a Democrat newspaper and a Republican newspaper. There were conservative newspapers and liberal newspapers. It's only been fairly recently, in some decades, that we've now pretended that news organizations are just neutral, the view from nowhere. And I don't think that's realistic, and I don't think that's effective. Now, when I say that, it also doesn't mean that I think everyone should know how journalists feel about the things that they cover. I certainly don't want to know how political reporters feel about the politicians they cover, whether they like them or not, whether they agree with them or not. I don't want to know that, but I'm not going to be naive and pretend that they don't have those feelings. We have to be objective in how we implement and execute our reporting and our writing, and we rarely are, right? There's so much about journalism that is not objective. Who we write about, who we put at the top of a story, how much space we give to someone in the story versus someone else, whether that story goes on the front page or on the, on the inside. What is the headline? What do we say is the most important thing? We can look at beats. I often talk about, we don't have a poverty beat, but we always have a crime beat. That's a decision. Someone has decided that covering crime is more important than covering poverty as a beat. And those are not objective decisions. And I think when we liberate ourselves from pretending to have this objectivity, we can just be more honest about why we cover what we do, how we cover it, and whether we're actually serving democracy or serving our citizenry in how we do that.
There's another question from Johannesburg.
Hello, my name is Stasio
Yeah.
Valai from Mozambique. Nicole.
Hey, man.
Hey, how you
Stasio.
doing, Ron? I think we're going to miss the jazz
I'm good,
section
man.
this time. Yeah. My question goes to
We'll get in.
what? You can keep coming. It's okay, Ron.
We'll yeah.
That's okay. My question goes to Nicole. You did mention the issue of lack of opportunities and kind of difference between the white newsroom opportunities as well. My question is, I went and I did research about several funds or grants. One of the interesting things I found was grants for people of color and grants for, let's say, normal people. My question is, how does it help? How can we shape this system or minimize all this difference? I mean, do you really think that this issue of funds for people of color, grants for people of color, does really help? Or this goes further to the system which is already constructed, and also this issue end up undermining the access for people of color to the highest level in the way how they can be, not been doing investigative journalism, but in the way on achieve highest level, not performance, of course. I don't know if you understood my question.
So you're asking, do I think that funding and grants is an obstacle?
Yes, and as I was saying, we do have what's called grants of funding for people of color or colored people, many in USA. How do you look to this issue in order to shape all these differences? Does it really help or end up undermine more this system which it's already installed until today, since you begin with the investigation in terms of racial issues?
I mean, I think money always helps, but money alone won't resolve the issue. So yes, I think it is harder for Black institutions to get the same kind of fundraising dollars and backing as other institutions. To this day, we've in the U.S. seen a proliferation of nonprofit investigative newsrooms. None of them are Black. And many of them haven't hired very many Black people either. So I think that funding matters, but funding alone isn't going to change the landscape of inequality in newsrooms. There has to be, frankly, quotas are illegal, but I think the newsrooms have to be transparent about who they've hired. I think they have to set goals on, and then they have to be held responsible or hold themselves responsible when they're not fulfilling those goals. But I do think Black and other non-white news organizations could use more funding. Black initiatives, of course. I mean, the same inequality you see everywhere is reflected in funding of these organizations. And I don't know, Ron, do you have a better answer than that?
Well, I mean, I think your answer pretty much covers it, that there are disparities in the funding of journalists from marginalized communities across the board. I mean, across the world, you see that. Who gets funding and who doesn't, who gets access to the philanthropic community and who doesn't. And that is reflective when, Black journalists are brought, or journalists in marginalized communities are brought into things rather than running them, because even when there is money to bring in folks from marginalized communities, that money gets used by white institutions to bring people in, but they don't run it. So I think that is a problem as well.
And if to add on that just quickly, it's also it's somewhat degrading that Black people and other marginalized groups always have to be hired with additional money, right? Like there has to be these special grants that are going to newsrooms to entice them to hire journalists of color, when really y'all should just be hiring people, and you shouldn't have to get some special extra pot of funding to convince you to do that. So you're not wasting your regular money on hiring us, right? There's something really degrading about that. I appreciate philanthropies who have said, and foundations who have said, we're going to fund you because only if you are filling these positions with people of color. I appreciate that, because money does talk, but also it just shouldn't have to be done that way. And what I also find troubling, speaking to a global audience, of course, is look who is covering the continent of Africa for these kind of global media companies. They're not people who are from Africa. They're not Black, right? We're not even getting the opportunities to cover the places where.
There's a question here related to the next 1619 projects from Kyle Cullen. Kyle, if I mispronounced your name, apologies, but it says, have you found the push in Republican states to ban 1619 difficult to process as a journalist? Has any of your other work ever received such harsh pushback politically or in academia?
Have I found it hard? Thank you for the question. I've been surprised. Absolutely. I would be lying if I didn't say that it's been more than 2 years now since we published the 1619 project. And I certainly could not have predicted that there would be legislation against the project, that the President of the United States would produce an entire presidential commission, an executive order against the project, that powerful state senators would be trying to prohibit its teaching. None of that I couldn't have predicted. And no, I've been writing about racial inequality my entire career. I've been a journalist for 2 decades. I've been writing for the New York Times and ProPublica, so 2 national news organizations, about racial inequality for more than a decade. And nothing I've ever done has received this type of pushback or scrutiny or efforts to discredit. And I thought a lot about why that is, because most of my work has been about, calling people out right now for what they're doing right now. And it's only when I went all the way back 400 years to try to challenge the narrative of America, the origin story, kind of the national collective memory of America, that you realize what people in power actually find dangerous about this work. And I got caught up in that. And I think last year with the global protests against George Floyd and Breonna Taylor, and you started to see even almost a majority of Republicans saying that systemic racism was a major obstacle to Black equality, where you hadn't tended to see that. They tended to see racial inequality as being about individual Black people just not living up to their opportunities. And so the backlash, I also think, is a response to those protests and to this short-lived racial reckoning, and an election where a white nationalist president was trying to hold on to power. And I've gotten caught up in all of those things.
I do think that is interesting, that one of the things that you highlighted in the 1619 project is Thomas Jefferson, one of the founding fathers of the US and third president, who famously wrote, "All men are created equal, but own people."
Yes.
Right? It's just the dichotomy there. Let me go back to Johannesburg. There's a couple of other, let me get one more question, and then Anton Harbor, I think, wants to add something as well. So let me get one more question from Joe Berg.
Thanks. This was a really interesting session. I'm just aware of the fact that, the demographics and issues in African newsrooms are very, very different than the demographics and issues in American newsrooms. and listening to the conversation, kind of placing myself as a white South African, also, with some American background, in South Africa, and I'm kind of struggling with how to phrase the question, but it links to Gregory's question around bias, and how investigative journalism and how newsrooms function, and they need to present themselves as unbiased, objective, but at the same time, Nicole, I hear your argument that you need to place yourself in the journalism, because we all have our own biases and our own ideas and everything else. So my question really is, how do small African newsrooms, community newsrooms, which are 100% Black, but which maybe don't have the power, don't have the funding, things like that, how do they deal with those issues?
I'm not entirely clear on the question. How do Black newspapers on the continent deal with issues of what?
In Africa, it's more a question of power. So, journalists who come from rural backgrounds who, present and they don't have the right accents or something like that, then their stories aren't told. And yeah, my question really is, if we're going to paint the editors as having the power because they come from a specific demographic background or whatever, then aren't we kind of painting all of the newsrooms with the same brush? And isn't it kind of the same slippery slope of saying, okay, well, you're white, so you can't cover these issues, or you're Black, so you can't cover these issues, or you're from, this area, so you can't cover these issues?
So that seems to be an entirely different question than you started off with. So I'm positive I never argued that only Black people can cover certain issues and only white people can cover certain issues. And even because I would never say that. Some of the greatest writers on race in America have not been Black. One of my all-time favorite books is a book called The Race Beat, written by two white journalists who won the Pulitzer Prize. On my website, talk about Claude Sitton, who was a white reporter who covered the civil rights movement and turned it into, in many ways, a national story in national media. So I would never argue that, but I think it is naive and ahistorical and just simply inaccurate to pretend that in a society that was founded on slavery and that didn't grant Black people rights to citizenship until 50 years ago, that your racial experience doesn't shape how you see the world and how you cover the world. It clearly does. And I think it is in acknowledging that you are, as a white journalist or as a Black journalist, seeing the world through a lens only strengthens the journalism, because you're not pretending otherwise. So when I talk about race in the United States, it's still about power. It's just that the way that power has been shaped in the US is by race. In another place, power may be shaped by caste. In another place, power may be shaped by ethnic group, right? But it's all about power. It is who is dominating, and it is the group in whatever country you're in who is dominating, who ultimately often has the power to shape the coverage. What we're arguing for is breaking down that power dynamic. We're arguing for sharing that power so that you can actually more fully cover the communities that you live in. Every community is diverse in some way. Just the primary dividing line in America is race. But there are many divisions. I talk about socioeconomic status. I think a major blind spot in many national newsrooms, at least, is that most of the people have come from a working class background, and they actually have very poor understanding of how it is for regular folks who are hourly wage earners, and that's a problem. So it really is about examining power wherever you are. And every newsroom, no matter where you are, has its own community power dynamics that I think really deform coverage. If you look at the New York Times, and look at the coverage in the New York Times, and then you look at where the New York Times is located, which is in New York City, a majority Black and Latino city, but our coverage does not reflect the lives of the majority of the people who live in the city. That's probably a true in Johannesburg, that the coverage there is not reflecting the lived experiences of the majority of people who live there. And I think that that's something that we should challenge. But let me just reiterate for anybody watching this today, I have never argued that you only can cover the community that you come from. Who would want to do that, and who would argue that? You do, however, have to understand that there is an expertise in covering these communities, and that you should actually study and try to get some expertise in covering those communities if you're going to cover them.
All right, thank you, Nicole. We will have Anton Harvick come, who wants to wrap us up. Anton?
Your input and presence at the conference in what has been a most germane and interesting and stimulating discussion. Thank you to both of you. And let me say, Nicole, you said in the beginning that you've wanted a long time to engage in this conference. So let me now extend an invitation. I mean, Ron is the only person other than myself who's been to all 17 conferences, I believe. We hope to see both of you at our conference next year around this time, in person.
Definitely.
We're all looking forward to a big, proper conference again. So thank you very much for your time. I have one small housekeeping announcement just for the Johannesburg room. When you come in tomorrow morning, it is important that you have given yourself COVID clearance. So you need to dial this number on your cell phone. *120*. I'll repeat it. *120*8501#. That enables you to clear yourself tomorrow morning to come into campus again. Please do it before you arrive. That's *120*8501#. Thank you very much. It's been a long and full and busy day. My beard has got a bit grayer in the course of the day. I look forward to seeing you all tomorrow for another packed, full, I think very interesting day. See you in the morning. Have a good night's rest. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks, Nicole. Okay.